Welcome back to the Ripewave audio community, where we explore together all types of home audio systems from hi-fi to home theater. My name is John, and for this video, we will continue our top AV processor separates under $5,000 series, which support immersive audio formats for at least 12 channels. For part 5, we look at the I/O of these processors and what they provide to our external components. If you missed part 1, where we outlined the main criteria for the channels, format support, and room calibration, or part 2, where we examined the DACS these processors utilize, or part 3, where we describe the connectivity from Ethernet to Internet streaming features, or part 4, where we put forward the physical characteristics that define these processors, I have provided the links for your convenience in the description. For those that viewed the other parts, you are aware that we are researching AV processors so Ripewave Audio can make a more educated decision when we replace our 5.1 channel Sony TA-E9000ES processor with a new immersive processor. As before, keep in mind that your criteria may be different from ours, but use this content to help you make your own choices. The list of processors we are examining is a filtered down set from 141 models, 26 brands Ripewave Audio has in its database. By setting the criteria for the models under $5,000, immersive, separate, non-receiver, non-discontinued units, the pool of candidates dropped to 13 models from 9 brands: Anthem, Arcam, Emotiva, Lexicon, Marantz, McIntosh, Monoprice, Rotel, and Yamaha. Our guidance so far is varied, with different winners in each part. Part 1, we looked at the main criteria, and for speaker counts, we selected the Anthem AVM-70. And for formats, the Marantz AV7706 checked the most boxes. For Part 2, the DACS, the overall winner was the Emotiva RMC1 range. But if you're looking for high-res music support, look no further than the Yamaha CX-A5200. In Part 3, looking at the connectivity, for all-in-one unit with 8K support, the winner went to Marantz AV7706. For integration support that still had an 8K upgrade, we selected the Anthem AVM-70. And then in our last part, Part 4, we looked at the physical characteristics. Based on looks alone, the Anthem AVM-70 won the prize for being the most modern, and the McIntosh MX100 took the prize for having the classic application. For performance, we selected Marantz's AV8805 and Yamaha's CX-A5200, which had great build quality. The current overall category leaders are, with 1 win each, Emotiva, the RMC1 range, McIntosh's MX100, Marantz's AV8805, and with 2 wins each, Yamaha CX-A5200 and Marantz's AV7706. And with the most wins so far, with 3, is the Anthem AVM-70. While there is a chance that a consistent runner-up could be selected in the end, this current list of winners does point out which models are running strong. Let's see if round 5 changes the leaderboard. We define I/O as the physical connections, inputs and outputs to and from the processor, which either receive signals from the source components or send signals to output devices such as televisions, speakers, or headphones. The I/O also addresses wired connections for integrations such as triggers, infrared, and other protocols. While we covered the general speaker counts in Part 1, we will cover how the processor provides the physical connections which send the signal out to final amplification. Ripewave Audio recently received feedback that there is some confusion on how we count processing channels. Thank you, Mark, for that comment. I believe the issue stems from the inconsistency in how counts are portrayed on brand websites. Sometimes they are not just different, but misleading, particularly with subwoofer counts. It is hard to know the speaker configurations of a processor as advertised, for example, 13.2. What does that really support without digging into the manual? And sometimes even the manual doesn't tell the whole story. As our aim is to add clarity, not to add to the confusion, we have decided to represent the processing capabilities using multiple conventions in our surround sound infographics going forward. This slide describes the features of these new graphics. We will continue two practices. One, the total processing count will still be represented as a single number, the 12 and 16 in the slide example. And two, we will represent subwoofer counts that are independently processed and controlled, unless we are explicitly describing physical ports on the unit. We will show the two most frequently used methods of speaker placement-based counts. One, speaker.subwoofer, which is the total of all speakers separate from the subwoofers, and two, ear.subwoofer.height, which totals the ear level speakers separate from both the subwoofers and the height totals. Above ear level is the total of the wall plus the ceiling mounted speakers. Ear level speakers are represented by orange boxes, while high speakers and subwoofers are depicted as gray boxes. In some cases, the maximum counts depend on configuration choices. Those are represented by the blue speaker boxes, such as the example on the right, where the owner must decide if they're going to use the configuration with more subwoofers, front wides, or height channels without going over the total count of 16, and results in configurations ranging between 7.5.4 and 9.1.6. Given the configuration range, the speaker.subwoofer count is listed twice in those cases, with the alternate count shown below the total. In this case, the alternate count is 15.1. The standard representation, 11.5 count, is shown in the upper left. Finally, we added in the immersive format icons, Dolby Atmos, DTS:X, DTS:X Pro, and Aural 3D, which only display if the format is supported by that processor, to provide some additional context to the counts. For example, if DTS:X Pro is not supported, DTS:X content may not natively play back on all speakers if you have a system greater than 13.1. With the infographic explained, let's get into what each model supports for I/O. We will move up in channel count as we go along. Therefore, we will start with our current processor we are replacing. At the time I purchased the Sony TA-E9000ES, the Dolby Digital EX and DTS-ES 6.1 surround formats were just emerging. However, I was fine skipping those to focus on 5.1 decoding. Looking at this model, we see a nice 1/4-inch headphone jack on the front, where it should be. The power cord is permanently attached. No IEC removable jack as we see today. The RS-232 port was only there for upgrades, not for integration, but it was one of the first models that was upgradable. While there are no HDMI ports in this era, there was a wider selection of digital and analog sources, including tuner, tape, and mini disc, and DAT labeled connections, which have largely disappeared. The SPDIF counts are fortunately high in this pre-HDMI period. One major issue was the lack of 5.1 inputs, which caused Sony to release a companion analog preamp, the TA-E9000ES, to enable the use of Super Audio CD players for multi-channel playback. The 5.1 output is supplied via unbalanced RCA ports, which was the standard of the day. Sony provided their proprietary S-Link for integration, which is incompatible with today's voltage and protocol-based triggers. They also favored S-Video over component, but with HDMI, we have no use for either in our setup. There is a moving magnet phono input, which we are using. Finally, this model has 2 switch power outlets on the back, which is something that no model in this review has. It is probably best to isolate the power of other devices away from the processor. When we filtered our list of processors, we set a minimum of 12 channels. So our I/O review begins with 12-channel models, and we started with the Lexicon MC-10. Looking at this 12-channel 11.1, 7.1.4 surround supporting processor, we see big changes from our now vintage processor. HDMI is now the dominant source signal, but SPDIF remains with 4 coax and 2 optical inputs. There is a choice of balanced XLR or unbalanced 11.1 connections. Lexicon uses a color coding scheme for their I/O, which is adopted in many models covered in this series. Black backgrounds for inputs and white backgrounds for outputs. It is a scheme we've carried over in our own slides here for consistency. However, you'll notice for this model, Zone 2 output has a background that is black. I'm not sure that was a conscious design decision. We also see a removable IEC power cord jack, which is on all of these models. And we are happy to see that has become the standard at this level. This model also sports an FM/AM tuner, which is a nice to have and often neglected source. The Rotel models are unique, as they're the only ones without balanced XLR outputs. We will cover the RSP 1576 and RSP 1576 Mark II at the same time, as they have identical I/O, with only room calibration and a $1,100 price difference separating the two. Interestingly, there is a single XLR balanced input. Like the other 12-channel models in this group, the Rotel have one HDMI output with audio return channel, or ARC for short. SPDIF is only supported as an input. Rotel provides a 7.1 analog input. The 7.1 analog input is less necessary today given HDMI, but if you own a Super Audio CD or ultra high definition player that has a nice set of DACS, you may leverage this input. There is no headphone jack on these 12-channel 7.1.4 models. The last 12-channel model is the McIntosh MX100. McIntosh has positioned the MX100 as a processor for digital sources with no analog I/O aside from the prerequisite pre-outs, which are all XLR balanced connections. Ripewave is fine dropping legacy support in general. However, complete removal of analog inputs requires that a phono source will need to be converted to digital before entering this processor. Despite the digital emphasis, the MX100 has the lowest digital count with only 4 HDMI, 2 coax, and 2 optical inputs, and only 1 HDMI out. No tuner, no headphone jack on the MX100 either. Clearly this processor is designed with home theater as its main purpose and not as a central command center. As with the other 12-channel models, the MX100 only supports Dolby Digital and DTS:X for configurations up to 7.1.4. The Yamaha CX-A5200 is among two 13-channel models supporting 7.2.4 configurations for Dolby Atmos and DTS:X formats, which may be sufficient for many installs and introduces dual subwoofer control. With the CX-A5200, we see the first entry with eARC support, which makes it possible to receive uncompressed multi-channel audio playback from an eARC supporting television. Yamaha provides a high level of legacy support and includes component video inputs as well as a moving magnet phono stage. The inclusion of an XLR balanced input is nice to have should you have high quality external DACS feeding into the CX-A5200. The two-zone outputs are good for those wiring for multiple rooms. This model has an FM/AM tuner and headphone jack. The Marantz AV7706 is a past and present processor like the Yamaha, but ups the game with 8K support on the input and two outputs. It is the first model with DTS:X Pro and Aural 3D support. While Marantz is also an 11.2 processor, it is more flexible with its speaker configurations. With the AV7706, it is possible to select between more heights, 7.2.4 like the Yamaha, or to add front wides, not possible with the Yamaha, for a 9.2.2 configuration. The Marantz AV8805 takes speaker count up a level with 15 channels, 13.2 support. Flexible like the AV7706, the AV8805 can be configured with or without front wides, but this time you get two more heights with each option for either a 7.2.6 or 9.2.4 configuration. As Ripewave Audio feels that 4 heights is much better than 2, we would not recommend the front wide option on the AV7706 if you are planning for the immersive audio experience as we are. The AV8805 presents two good choices, 7.2.6 or 9.2.4, and is really down to your room design at that point. Otherwise, the AV8805 I/O is like that of the AV7706, but without support for 8K at this time. These two Marantz models are the only products within our criteria that support all immersive formats. With 16 channels on board, the Arcam AV40 can support 9.1.6 configurations without making that hard choice to drop height channels when considering the addition of front-wide speakers. With only one independent subwoofer output, you will lose a bit of control with the AV40. This model doesn't have the same level of legacy support as the Marantz and Yamaha models, which is true here on forward. It is interesting that Arcam decided on Aural 3D over DTS:X Pro. As a 16-channel processor, the more common DTS:X source material may seem constrained with only 13 channels of playback using the standard DTS:X decoding. The AV40 has a headphone jack and phono input along with one zone output. The XMC-2 is the first of 3 models from Emotiva, sporting 13.3 to 15.1 configurations, which translates to 7.3.6 to 9.1.6 speaker configurations. Emotiva uniquely supports up to 3 independent subwoofers, albeit not the highest count that we will see. Emotiva is the only 16-channel processor yet to incorporate support for DTS:X Pro or Aural 3D. This model does support an FM/AM tuner and headphone jack, but does not have an onboard phono stage. Legacy support is sparse, but sufficient given that HDMI has been so dominant in the last decade, and Emotiva is up among those with the highest counts for digital input support. Not only does Emotiva provide an XLR balanced input, but they also provide an AES EBU digital input, which we will only see with one other brand. The RMC-1L and their flagship, the RMC-1 models, provide the same I/O as the XMC-2 with an additional coax and Toslink digital input. The RMC-1, while physically supporting expansion modules for more inputs and potentially a phono input, Emotiva has yet to release any of the planned modules, so we will have to see. The Monoprice Monolith HTP1 has configurable speaker layouts. They take subwoofer options to the highest with up to 5 subwoofer outputs. Doing so does subtract from either the front wides or height channels, resulting in a configuration range from 7.5.4 to 9.1.6. Legacy support is at a minimum with the HTP1 and no phono input or headphone output. Unlike the McIntosh MX100, you are at least not stuck if you have 1 or 2 analog sources. eARC support is present, and like the Emotiva models, the HTP1 has 1 AES EBU digital input. Monoprice supports Aural 3D, but does not support DTS:X Pro, as with the Arcam AV40. To our knowledge, the Anthem AVM-70 may be the only 17-channel 15.2 processor in the world and supports up to 9.2.6 configurations without compromise. For those wanting more subwoofers, the AVM-90 adds 2 for 19 channels, 15.4 processing, and a 9.4.6 configuration. But that is out of our price range at double the cost of the AVM-70, the AVM-90 being $6,999. Anthem has kept legacy support about medium with 4 analog inputs and a phono stage. eARC is supported. There is a 1/4-inch headphone jack, but there's no FM/AM tuner. Now, let's take a look at all the models together in a table view. For this, we have divided into 2 sections, 2 pages per section to cover them all. Our first view shows up to the first 16-channel model, the Arcam AV40. This one page alone shows how modern these processors are, with much more in speaker configuration over our 5.1 processor. It became clear that Marantz is checking most of the boxes once again in this comparison. Certain features, like headphones and FM/AM radios, are spotty, and they were features that were once considered must-haves in the last century. The exception would be those who purchase a separate tuner, but only a few external FM/AM tuners are available, such as the Project Tuner Box S for around $165. If you want it built in, look for the Arcam, Lexicon, Emotiva, Marantz, and Yamaha models. While Lexicon, Arcam, and Emotiva have headphone jacks, They supply it as an 1/8" phono jack, not the 1/4" like Yamaha, Marantz, and Anthem. The other brands, Rotel, McIntosh, and Monoprice, neglect headphones altogether, which we feel is a miss. The Marantz AV7706 even supports Bluetooth headphones, the only model which does. All models support Ethernet, removable IEC power cords, and USB inputs, which we didn't mention earlier. Turning to the I/O summary table, we see that all models support eARC at 13 channels and above, less the Emotiva models. Otherwise, ARC is supported. The McIntosh MX100 is the only model which we feel doesn't provide enough I/O, with only 4 HDMI ins and 1 out, and no analog whatsoever. As mentioned earlier, only Rotel doesn't support balanced XLR outputs, which we feel is out of step with the trends at this level of product. If you want XLR inputs, you will see a maximum of 1, and Rotel does support, along with Yamaha, Marantz, the AV8805 only, and Emotiva. While AES EBU interfaces are not very common with home audio, typically with higher-end CD, SA/CD players, models from Emotiva and Monoprice have a single AES EBU digital input. We also noted earlier that Ripewave audio has no need for legacy video support, but if you do, you will have to stay with Yamaha or Marantz. You will also find triggers and other integration options on all models. If a model does not have sufficient I/O, it could be a deal breaker. It is certainly nicer if you can directly connect all your sources into a processor without needing to use some sort of external switcher or converter box. In some cases, it does make sense. For example, Ripewave audio is at the stage in its audio maturity where we are ready to move to an external phono preamp. We also need more HDMI inputs. Currently, our Samsung 4K TV is addressing the HDMI gap with its breakout box supporting 4 HDMI inputs. That box has a toslink output, which we have connected to the HDMI-less Sony processor. While the optical output is limited to 5.1 signals, that is all our processor can handle anyway, so that is okay until we upgrade, but we are at capacity and cannot add another video game console. With only 4 inputs, the McIntosh MX100 will not provide any future expansion, won't be a good choice for our needs. A 7.1 multi-channel input set would be nice to have, but if we step back, we realize that we don't have any sources that decode multi-channel out to 7.1 analog outputs. Furthermore, we are perfectly happy keeping multi-channel audio in the digital domain until it hits the processor. The DACS in many of these processors are pretty good, and our preferred multi-channel delivery mechanism that is digital is HDMI, and it doesn't have the same sampling rate restriction as coax and toslink. If we did need that feature, we would be looking to Rotel and Marantz for a 7.1 input. Now, Yamaha has a multi-channel input, but it is only 5.1 channels. We suspect that multi-channel inputs will continue to fade as HDMI use only grows. A choice of balanced XLR or unbalanced RCA outputs is the most common, but Rotel hasn't provided balanced outputs, and Emotiva and McIntosh only provide balanced XLR outputs, which is the better of the two cost-reducing options. You can always use an XLR to RCA cable if your amplifier does not have balanced inputs. If we keep cable link short and isolated from noisy environments, we may be all right. But we would rather play it safe and go balanced. So we may stay clear of Rotel. As an audio enthusiast, we want to avoid compression. So eARC is in and ARC is out. So where did those cuts leave us? We said we must have eARC. Now that excludes Lexicon, Rotel, McIntosh, and Emotiva. We said we must have balanced outputs. That excludes Rotel again. Now we would like a 1/4-inch headphone jack, but that lowers the impression of Lexicon, Arcam, Emotiva, Rotel, McIntosh, and Monoprice. What models address these needs? Yamaha, Marantz, and Anthem. If we just look at the physical I/O and not the format support covered in Part 1 or the 8K support covered in Part 3, then the Anthem AVM-70 is the winner of Part 5 for its full 9.2.6 speaker configuration support. Marantz is 2 channels behind with their AV8805, and the Marantz AV7706 and Yamaha CX-A5200 are both 4 channels behind the frontrunner. We will note that Yamaha and Marantz support at least 7.2.4, which we believe is perhaps the sweet spot for a noticeable increase with the immersive experience. Beyond that, there will be improvements, but with diminishing returns. As we must select a winner each round, the award then goes to the Anthem AVM-70, which brings their total to 4 rounds, which is further increasing their lead. If you are in the market for an AV processor, what I/O is important to you? Do you have a lot of legacy sources to connect? Are balanced outputs necessary, or are they more cool than beneficial? That feedback would be useful to the Ripewave audio community. Furthermore, if you enjoyed this video and are interested in enhancing your audio experience, please like and subscribe to this Ripewave audio community, and be sure to select the bell icon so you'll be notified as soon as the next video is posted. Until then, keep evolving your audio experience.